record. All right. So welcome everyone to Elevate Lane County's Working Wednesday. My name is Brianna Vincent and I'm a project coordinator with Connected Lane County. We are halfway through our fall webinar series where each Wednesday we take a deep dive into one or two of the New World of Work's top 10 professional skills, which Oregon has adopted as its employability skills. These are recognized by industry, K-12 education, and post-secondary education as the most important skills we need to develop in order to be career ready. So today we're going to be exploring the imperative professional skill of communication. And joining us into a deep dive, there are three professionals from various industries. So thank you all for being here today in this panel. And then can everyone just go ahead and introduce themselves, and then we'll get kicked off with some questions.
I'll start. I'm Rachel Ulrich. I run a consulting firm called Are You Talking Consultants. I have about 25 years, a little more, in human resources, primarily working in the banking industry, though more recently I've been working in professional services and all the way into farming and some agricultural work.
So I'll kick in next. I'm Brandy Rhodes Brooks. I help to lead the team at Oregon Community Credit Union, our brand and experience team. So I've been in marketing for about 15 years in a variety of industries and have done everything from crisis communications all the way to advertising and marketing plans.
All right, and my name's Charmaine Endicott. I've been with Glory Bee over 12 years now, and with about 5 years in the HR department as HR generalist. So handle whatever needs to be handled, from employee consultation, event planning, strategic planning, recruiting, and development.
Awesome, thank you all. So I think we can all agree that communication is a pretty imperative skill to have, but in your opinion, can you talk a little bit about why communication is so important?
Do you have a special order you want us to
whoever wants to take them first. We can go in the same order or just popcorn. Yep.
Okay, well, I'll kick off. From my standpoint, communication is everything. And I think it's most important to look at what happens when communication doesn't happen properly. And I would estimate, from what I've read, 85 to 90% of the time when there's a problem or a conflict or an error, it's because of a miscommunication or a lack of communication. So if you don't learn to do it properly, either you might be unhappy or someone else might be unhappy, and your success won't be what it needs to be. And so learning to communicate effectively, both as a listener and as a communicator, is critically important to success in relationships as well as your career.
I think to echo a lot of those sentiments, the way we look at communication, especially in the marketing world, is it's not just conveying information, it's actually cultivating an experience with intention. So communication helps you to build bridges, and whether that's with your fellow employees, where you're hoping to build a relationship so that you can work productively together, or you're collaborating on a project, or you're in a communications field where you're actually cultivating that experience outward that someone might have with a brand. The way that you communicate in all the different forms helps to set up those bridges and helps to build that openness for collaboration and connection.
Yeah. The bridge building, I think, is important, because really establishing that communication is building a relationship with someone. And I think of communication as really your first impression with people, and how you communicate is building your own personal brand. You're marketing yourself in every form of communication that you put out into the world.
Yeah, awesome. I agree. I think that communication is two-part. It's, you are communicating, but when there's a breakdown, there's that secondary part of how do we go back and how do we fix that. So what forms of communication do you all use in your job? And is listening a part of your communication?
I can take this one to start.
Right.
And we were chatting beforehand, and I like to be prepared, so I have a bunch of notes. I'm going to be looking down at my notes occasionally. And that's just one form of communication that works for me, is to kind of prepare so I feel like I'm getting all my information out to you. So yes, to me, listening is definitely, absolutely a form of communication, but then other forms of communication you're going to use in the professional world and in your personal life are, of course, the verbal, nonverbal, and written. So I use verbal communication daily, you know, meeting with executive team and employees, assisting with conflict resolution. You have that verbal component to that. The nonverbal component comes into play when you're showing that you're interested in what's happening. You're showing interest in the situation and want to be able to help with a solution. So that comes through in facial gestures, in body language, and eye contact. And then written communication is all day long. So we've got the emails, we've got presentations, policies that we create and write, event promotion, and then trainings as well. So that's written is never ending.
So I can jump in. Helping to lead a creative team, I think we use if it's a form of communication, it's likely that we're using it. And I think about that in terms of my day is a variety of Zoom calls, and I'll go from a one-on-one with a team member to a senior team conversation on a strategy. I'll most likely be multitasking and responding in Slack at the same time, monitoring email. And so I think there's a lot of those forms of communication in terms of that verbal and written communication. But in addition to that, in the marketing world, I'm also looking at visual communication. So the human brain processes visual information significantly faster than anything else. And so when you think about your body language in a meeting, or when you're communicating with someone, or images that you select, we think of, you know, for example, how we design the architecture of our branch communicates the experience that we want you to have. So when I'm looking at communication, I'm looking at it across the board in terms of all of the different presentations I'm selecting, the pictures I use. Friday stand-ups, we start off with GIFs and everybody piles in there with images to create some camaraderie. So we're really looking at a full spectrum of communication that I think expands out from what's kind of more traditional, to really leverage all of the different communication styles and then make sure that it aligns to the audience that I'm speaking to.
Nice. So those are all fantastic. So there's only two areas I would highlight, since we're speaking to people that are coming new into the workforce and looking for tools for success. Two areas that I think are critically important in your own communication. First is your writing skills. And I think we underestimate how important those writing skills are. You know, pay attention when you're taking your classes and do learn the proper way to set up sentence structure and how to make an argument. For instance, I've had to talk a lot of times with people about when you're talking to somebody in a higher up position, it's usually more effective to start your communication with the tip of the iceberg. What's your main point? And then fill in how you got there or what the supporting information is. So that's just a tidbit on communication. Start with your primary, what's your takeaway you want them to walk away from. The other part is the active listening part. It has been my frustration over time that frequently when you're in a meeting or on a Zoom call, that there are folks that there's no facial expression happening. In fact, I can tell they're looking at their phone or looking at something else on a split screen. And it really tells me something about you and your interest in the topic or in me personally as I'm speaking. And so work on that. Make sure you're thinking about how you're being received when you're sitting in any kind of meeting, whether it's one-on-one or a large group.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rachel. I think COVID and everything that has happened has really put us into a new world of communicating, a new world of working together, and listening, and definitely getting used to how to communicate and actively listen during Zoom calls when there's just so much, other things going on. So thank you. So in the New World of Work standards list, they have LinkedIn or PowerPoint slides, and knowing how to use social media appropriately in work settings as forms of communication. Why do you think that they use these examples?
Well, I think LinkedIn in particular and PowerPoint are both considered standard forms of communication when you're giving a presentation on the PowerPoint side of it. And then LinkedIn from just a business contact and networking standpoint. I would, however, say that those are almost dated to list LinkedIn and PowerPoint specifically. And I'm super interested to hear what Brandy says about Slack. Because it's something new I've been hearing about and I have no exposure to. So I'm hoping between Charmaine and Brandy, they can tell you about some other forms of interaction that are happening out there more currently.
Yeah, I think, looking at this and seeing LinkedIn, the first thing that came to my mind is how you're presenting yourself in terms of your professional brand as an individual. And that can be either while you're looking for work or how you interact as a professional in building that network. I think Slack and some of those channels are also a great opportunity to do that. I know when I'm recruiting a role, I'm looking at the social media channels that my folks are engaging with and making determinations before I hire on what that looks like. So as you gear up to enter the workforce, I would very much look at the social media profiles, and I wouldn't limit to just LinkedIn to ensure that the way you're presenting yourself, just as you would in picking your outfit for your first interview, that you're paying attention to that and you're positioning yourself in a way that's going to highlight your strengths and demonstrate that you have the skills needed for the position that you're going into. From my perspective, I agree. I think PowerPoint is a bit dated, although I make PowerPoint decks like they're going out of style. It's a classic and much used mode of communication. Depending on the kind of role you're going into, most of my time is collaborative with stakeholders. And so oftentimes I am having communications to pull in a variety of opinions and perspectives, pare that down into a strategy that we produce, and then going back to say, okay, here's how that worked. Here's what we saw. And PowerPoint is a huge tool for me to be able to facilitate those conversations in both directions. So whether it's PowerPoint or another mode of a presentation tool, having that ability to cultivate a presentation that's going to engage your stakeholder audience is really critical. So I think looking at those things as tools is important. The other thing I would say that this question kind of triggered for me is communications at a brand perspective is changing. And so most workforces are also looking to you as an employee as a representation of their brand and their organization. And so it's likely that you might join a team at some point who will have some protocols in place on how they want you to engage with social media, when it's acceptable to be on your personal channels representing the company and when it's not. So making sure that you have the ability to be flexible in those spaces in how you present yourself, to put your best foot forward, but then to also follow the policies and recommendations of your organization is pretty important.
Good. Yeah, I can say from personal experience, even with LinkedIn, it took me just a little bit to be comfortable even creating an account because I'm more of a private person. I didn't want to connect with a bunch of people that I didn't necessarily know, but just kind of learning the importance of it really helped me to accept that that was just a part of what needs to happen in today's professional world. So I 100% agree that anything you put out there online is part of your personal brand. It's discoverable. by anyone in the world. So just being aware of that and thoughtful of that. And also what you put online shows your thoughtfulness, shows your dedication to the process, and shows that you're able to prepare as well.
Great, thank you.
One thing too I wanted to mention, kind of a tool, we're mentioning tools and kind of the next stage of tools in regards to PowerPoint. We're actually researching what's called Prezi, and you guys might know about Prezi. It's kind of the next, the higher up of PowerPoint. So instead of going from slide to slide, there's a lot of animation to it. It's lively, it's engaging. So that would be a good takeaway for any additional tools. Prezi.
Prezi.
That's it, yep. Prezi.
Great, thank you. Rachel, you had mentioned when you're talking to kind of higher ups or execs, bringing just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but in kind of thinking about how to speak with supervisors or directors, can you talk a little bit about how to practice communicating effectively with supervisors, especially if you're nervous about it, in like maybe your first or second job?
Yeah, and thank you, Olivia, for the question on that. So the best thing is to be honest. And so to be straightforward with a supervisor and say, I'm kind of nervous about this, but I want to make sure we're having good communication. So if I say something that you don't understand where I'm coming from, or if you say something that I'm not really clear on, is it okay if we just ask each other? And by having that starter conversation, it really gives your supervisor permission to give you a little more feedback. And feedback is the most effective way for you to be constantly growing. You hate to have things being surmised about you without you knowing that that's the takeaway your supervisor has. So it's really important to ask for feedback. Anybody else have a comment on that?
Yeah, does anyone else want to follow up?
I think I would echo that. Being open to that feedback is fantastic, and being transparent. The other thing that I would say is really helpful, especially if you're new in that profession, is following up in the conversation. So if you've had a conversation with your supervisor and you've been open about the fact that you're nervous and you're looking for feedback to help you grow, you want to end that conversation by saying something like, what I've heard from you is I should do this and this and this. That will help you make sure that you have really clear guidelines on what your supervisor is expecting, and then having those guardrails in place, oftentimes, because that's giving you a roadmap on how to perform and how to engage with them, it just helps eliminate the nervousness the next time around.
One more thing to add too is when you go into those conversations, Rachel, I agree with you just mentioning I'm a little nervous about this situation, but there's something I want to talk to you about. Know that your supervisor is there to help you, but honestly, you coming to them with a question or a concern is also helping to teach them. It's helping them become a better supervisor. It's helping them to understand how to coach better and how to communicate better. So you want to bring those concerns forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So can you talk about, in your opinion, what's the best way to build your vocabulary or learn correct grammar, and how important are those things in a professional space? Whoever wants to start.
I can get started on that one. And I'm smiling because it's something I'm constantly working on. So I think just owning it and know that I'm always working on that. And I think that's the first step, just realizing that I can get feedback from other people. I can ask for input. And that's where you want to reach out to those people that you trust, whether it be a teacher or a parent or a friend, or if you have a coworker. There's often times where I'll have people review what I want to send out to the company just to make sure that it's issue free, it's been edited, and just trying to help set up myself for success too and learn as I go. One tool that I'd like to get out to everyone is a program called Grammarly, which you can set up on Outlook or Word, and it kind of double checks things as you go and suggests placement of commas or, switching up the sentence. So that's been helpful for me. And then of course, reading to increase your vocabulary. Something I like to do as well is just, the passions that we have. Find podcasts that you're interested in, and just listening to podcasts is also going to help you increase your vocabulary as well. So those are some of the tools that I use, as well as taking time to reread my emails before I actually send them out.
Huge.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quick and say those were excellent and exactly right. And the only one I would add is finding your heroes, people who both internally in your organization, but even more importantly, out in the external world, in your area of focus or just in general, listen to their podcasts, but also watch their YouTube videos or anything like that. Brene Brown is one of my favorites right now, and just watching her style, listening to her language, her ability to be casual and comfortable and yet very clear and use language effectively. I think those are great folks to listen to. One of my sister-in-law is Vietnamese, and her way to learn English was watching sitcoms. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as the way to learn the language of business, but finding effective ways to model watching other people interact that are truly successful can be very helpful.
Yeah, I would echo all of this. I mean, I use Grammarly for everything. It's plugged in on my phone, on my social channels, and my email. I definitely think, getting curious, listening to podcasts, reading books, and having that sphere of influence. So communication in business varies wildly depending on the profession you're in, right? If you're going to be in a tech company, it's likely going to be a little bit less formal and a little bit more fun versus a financial industry where, we've got lots of jargon we have to know, and we have to know how to leverage that. Starting in any profession, I think my big takeaway is be incredibly curious. Look at who's operating in the space that you're interested in and try to get as many different perspectives as you can. As you're entering the workforce, you're going to learn over time your authentic voice and how that actually aligns to your audience in a professional landscape. And you'll do that by really casting a wide net in what you're looking at, the type of people you're listening to. That will allow you to be flexible, not just in finding your own voice, but in making sure that you're engaging in the right way with your audience.
Those were great. Thank you. I think a key piece that I always need to remember is what you were saying, Charmaine, is just reading over your emails again. You're typing away so quickly because you have all these ideas and you want to get them out, but then going back and needing to make sure that you actually got it all out in the way that it was meant to come out. So small thing, but I think that's really important. So how might you change your tone and language when talking to high school students versus a group of their parents?
So I thought about this a little bit just in terms of marketing. Everything we do is targeted to our audience. And because for us, communication is not just getting the information that you want to share out, it's creating that bridging connection so you're engaging. So the first thought is, what is of the most value to the person I'm talking with? And then how can I make sure that I'm providing that when I'm speaking? So, thinking through that, being a marketing and communications person, the first thing I thought of was actually talking about communication best practices, right? I'm going to make assumptions about what high school students know that will be different than what I assume from their parents. And honestly, high school students, I think you guys might actually have a leg up on your parents with some of the communications best practices. When you think about content creation on your social channels and how you're presenting that own personal brand, you've already had more experience with that than your parents likely did. So you'll understand visual communications and some of those in a completely different way. You'll also understand the idea of having an omni-channel experience because you're presenting on potentially TikTok and Insta and a bunch of different things at the same time. And you'll know what that's like. Whereas I would make assumptions that speaking to your parents, they're going to want to know a lot more about what's happening in the profession. They'll make assumptions based on potentially more formal communications that they might have experience with. So depending on what that conversation looked like, I would first be trying to assess what value are you trying to get from this conversation? What assumptions might you be starting with as a baseline that can help me align that conversation? And then I could shift appropriately.
That's tough to follow. That was really good, Brandy.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that I would add into that, honestly, is just trying to determine, you mentioned value, Brandy, and I think of it as needs. What are your needs? And I have to think of what my audience needs from me. And when I think of high school students, I think, okay, they're probably going to want high energy. They're probably going to want it fast paced because they're ready to go on to the next topic immediately. So I'd look for engagement early on by asking questions and getting answers to them. So just trying to find different ways to connect with the high school students early into a presentation.
Yeah, the only thing I can add is for most of us who have been in the work world a little bit longer, we may fall into the trap of trying to talk too casually to you as newer employees in the work world. Please forgive us. We think we're cool and we're using hip language and we're nerds. We know it. And sorry, just sorry if we don't really talk to you the way we should as professional adults who are just starting your careers.
Sounds like just be understanding too. So can culture, gender, nationality, or social class have an effect on communication? Huge.
One of my favorite readings about that topic is from Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. And she talks about speaking white. And that her use of language and diction really sometimes differentiated her, ostracizing her sometimes, and allowing her to feel more accepted in other environments. And the whole code switching concept is really, really interesting. Obviously, there are pros and cons to how those play in. Learning the language of where you want to be successful, whether it's appropriately differentiated or not, is effective. And trying to help bridge gaps where language may be differentiated based on your background, or your ethnicity or anything like that, helping to be an educator will make the business world a stronger place.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's critical when you're entering the workforce at this point to be able to embrace the fact that people are coming from different life experiences than you are. And you'll be working alongside people with different experiences, different language abilities, trying your best to come from a place of empathy and understanding that you don't necessarily have agreement or alignment, even if you think you do, but being able to communicate through that and ensure that you're building that bridge again that's really critical to having that kind of collaboration, because workforces are getting incredibly engaged and having more diverse opinions, perspectives, backgrounds, and finding productive ways to do that.
I think about the different regions of the country and how that even affects our language and communication skills. I grew up in North Dakota, of all places, and carried some really odd phrases when I moved out this direction, and just kind of wording and sentence structure, like you mentioned, Rachel. And I'm working through that. But I think it also, it depends too on what kind of access our families, what kind of educational access our families had access to. That was access a lot. And then also what kind of access you had education to. So that's definitely going to affect your communication skills. And then just kind of being vulnerable to listen to where you need to improve, and finding different references and guidance to help you improve that.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple questions left, so if there's any other students who have questions, go ahead and pop those into the chat, and we can make sure to get those taken care of before we wrap up. So what role do facial expressions or gestures and pauses play in communication? I'm sure that probably has, magnified now that everyone's on Zoom and all you can see is just their face. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes, everything is magnified. And, I've read different things about whether you should keep your window open that shows your face when you're on a Zoom call. And it can be a huge distraction, but it also can give you a clue on how you look to everybody else in the room, and whether you are responding facially, or if you have any other like I like to talk with my hands, and so I'm trying to keep them down here because they're obviously a huge distraction when I put them up higher. But yeah, just maintaining an awareness of your facial expressions, and then becoming really good at reading other people's expressions and body language, and following up. We'll talk a little bit about active listening, but those expressions or nonverbals are a great way to trigger some questions.
And your gestures and facial expressions are really going to show your level of engagement. I was taught in a course, or I was told in the course, that instead of looking at the screen like I am right now and seeing all of you, that when you're presenting, to look at the camera so it feels like I'm looking out to each of you, which is challenging, because when I'm doing a training, I want to look at my students. I don't want to look at the camera. But that is one example on how you can engage, especially if you're going to be doing Zoom interviews in the future, which is definitely something that's happening now. Engaging with your teachers over your Zoom classes, having that eye contact, closing all other windows on your computer screen so you can really focus in on what's happening. Making sure your camera is on. If it's not, people will believe that you're probably up to something else. You're multitasking, answering emails, you're looking down at your cell phone. So just always having that engagement, and showing that engagement also through nods, through smiles, and that's part of the active listening that I know we'll get into.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you guys covered it really very well. I think for me, again, going back to the idea of how are you intentionally cultivating this experience, paying attention to those nonverbal cues is huge. You'll be able to see if people understand, if they agree. Being a leader of a very high-performing creative team, that really gives us a lot of insight into, are these ideas hitting? Are they the types of things we should be talking about? If someone is leaning back in the conversation, they're not necessarily on board with what you're saying, right? If they're leaning in, they are. So starting to pay attention to those cues, that will help you be a little bit more nimble and agile in the moment as you're presenting, whether that's in person or on Zoom. You can kind of get that sense and you can adjust from there to make sure that you're really hitting the mark.
Yeah, I know it's hard. There's a lot of distractions and everything, so I have to actively, make sure that I am paying attention, and the head nods and everything help me just to stay engaged with the conversation, just because there's always stuff going on in the background. And I wanted to pose these questions together because they do kind of flow into each other. So what is the difference? And you all kind of hinted towards it, but what's the difference between listening and active listening?
So active listening means that you're actively participating in the conversation. If you think about communication, communication is something leaves one person's mouth or typewriter, not typewriter, sorry, that made me old, keyboard, and has all kinds of intents and backgrounds and thought processes or lack of thought processes that go into them. And then they filter through whatever mechanism and they come into receivership by whoever is also receiving with their own filters, lenses, etc. And it is, if you think about the chances of you understanding exactly what I'm trying to convey, it's almost impossible. It's a miracle that people can get communication between one person and another. And so active listening is about checking to make sure you receive the message that was intended to be sent. So it's asking questions, it's repeating things back, and saying, so you do want me to go in the other room, or you do want me to write this project by this date. Can you tell me how long you expect it to be? Asking clarifying questions to make sure the communication was tight from beginning to end.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think when the difference between listening, listening is just you're hearing. I'm hearing that words are coming out of your mouth, and that's all that I'm understanding. But active listening, you're actually engaging, you're comprehending. Rachel, like you said, you're coming out of that conversation with questions, with actionable next steps, and confirming those next steps with the person that you were just meeting with.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me. We've all been in those conversations where you can tell that the person you're talking to is just waiting for you to be done. So it can be their turn and they can say something. That's listening. Maybe they heard your words, but they were definitely not paying attention to the meaning that you were trying to convey. For me, active listening is all of the things that the other two mentioned here, of making those clarifying questions, having that connection. But more than that, it's that mental shift to being open and curious. So when I'm actively listening, I'm in a mindset that is telling me I might change my opinions, my perceptions, my plan on how we're going to move forward based on the information that's being shared with me. So I'm listening in a way that is more open to change, and therefore paying more attention to what's behind what they're communicating to me. In the communication world, we're often filtering a lot of messages before it goes out for our brand. And one of the big pieces for us is to kind of get past that. Here's the information someone's sharing, but what's the meaning behind it? Because if I can get to that place, then I can be a lot more clear and concise on what really needs to happen moving forward. So I think when you're actively listening, just trying to have that mental cue to remind yourself to stay curious and stay open will ensure that you're doing more than just hearing the words that they're saying.
Yeah, that reminds me of that that quote. It's that you should listen to understand, not to answer, something like that. I think that's how it goes. So awesome. I don't see that we have any more questions coming in. So unless someone sneaks one in late, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for being a part of this panel on communication and your insights. It was wonderful, and hope to see you again all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.